Hello, this is again Dr. Jonathan Bentovish, and I'm recording another presentation about this new God's physics paradigm for 21st century physics. This is a book that was published by iUniverse.com several months ago, and it's been now published across the globe. It's being translated now to a few languages. By the way, this is another textbook with a few of my articles published a few years ago, and there's been over 70 to 80 now peer-reviewed scientific articles, and a third special issue coming out in international scientific journals dedicated to this new 21st century physics paradigm or scientific paradigm. Today's topic is actually very significant because today's topic is God's physics is the new scientific paradigm for 21st century physics and science more generally. And this follows now a major breakthrough, with the publication of these special issues, and specifically a verification of at least two initial unique critical predictions for this new God's physics paradigm, which is in a sense equivalent to the empirical validation of Einstein's general relativity theory just over 100 years ago, during the famous 1919 solar eclipse, and Eddington's verification of Mercury's double-valued perihelion pathway around the sun, found to be by Eddington, verified to be 1.6 arc as opposed to 0.8 arc predicted by Newton. So the 1.6 was a clear, unique and direct verification by Eddington of a critical prediction of Einstein's general relativity theory. And as we all know, the minute that Eddington did verify that Einstein's critical prediction was more accurate, in fact, and much more accurate than Newton's prediction, at that moment, or at that time, at that turning point, general relativity theory became the acceptable and the official paradigm for 21st century physics. And we stand at the historic point, which is just equivalent to that. Excuse me, and therefore, today's presentation about the fact that the new God's physics or computational unified field theory paradigm is now officially being accepted as the new paradigm, new physics, and more generally the new scientific paradigm for 21st century physics and science more generally. That's a turning point, and it's very significant. As a whole, this God's physics book, which is now being translated across the globe, these presentations that I'm taking time to deliver to the general public, over and beyond my keynote opening talks. I just gave such an opening talk in Eurospace 2021 in Paris, and I've delivered many opening talks in international conferences. But the reason that I'm taking this precious time to share with the general public, and of course with scientists, this major breakthrough, is because, as I'll highlight today, this scientific revolution, equivalent to Einstein's revolution of 100 years ago, is not just a major revolution in science. It has profound ramifications and profound, very hopeful new understanding for the general public and for humanity more generally. So let me begin just by again highlighting for the general public as well as for scientists the fact that with Thomas Kuhn's, he was a famous philosopher of science, as we all know, and he analyzed the manner in which science evolves. And his influential book in 1962, last century, whose title was The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, he essentially taught science how science and scientists, in what manner science evolves. And the profound insight that he had, which is accepted now across the board, on how science evolves, his profound analysis essentially highlighted the fact that science, in a sense, evolves by leaps and bounds, or it alternates, in a sense, between two phases. One phase is what he called standard science. If we take as an example, let's say, Newtonian mechanics of 19th century physics. So the standard paradigm of classical mechanics, of Newtonian classical mechanics, was the acceptable or standard paradigm for the 19th century and even before that. And so that meant that for a while, scientists see the usefulness, and it's established that that paradigm, in this case the older 18th, 19th century Newtonian mechanics, classical mechanics, was useful for a while. I give a metaphor of, just to make it clear, in a sense, illustrative for the general public. Imagine that a person is born in a room, in a confined room, and all that person knows is just the confinements of that room. For that person being born in that room, all they know of the world and the universe is that room. They know nothing else apart from their room. So, imagine that they're getting their food and clothes and everything that they need within that room. That's just a metaphor, obviously. And that would be equivalent to the standard paradigm that works perfectly well for a while. Newtonian mechanics worked perfectly well for a while. It explained a lot of phenomena. It was useful. It could explain a lot of details, a lot of data. But then Thomas Kuhn tells us science reaches a point where, metaphorically, there is knocks on the door. Perhaps there is a metal bar piercing through the window or through the wall. Phenomenon that cannot be explained just within that room. And so the person that's being born in that room has to realize, or starts suspecting, that there's something broader than the room. There's something outside that room, that the whole world or universe is not just that room. And that's, in a sense, the leaps and bounds. That's a case where the old paradigm, the old standard paradigm, reaches what Thomas Kuhn called a paradigmatic crisis. And a paradigmatic crisis, as we know, is a situation where the old paradigm, that old standard paradigm, which was very successful for a while, starts having a lot of problems, so to speak. It can't explain certain phenomena. There's theoretical inconsistencies within that paradigm. And again, the metaphor would be something piercing through the window or through the wall, bangs on the door. So the person says, what's that? What's the paradigm that the whole universe or the whole world is just this room doesn't hold any longer. I have to open the door. I have to investigate what is outside that room. And so that's how Thomas Kuhn teaches us that science has to, in a sense, expand from a confined room, to opening the door and seeing that the room is valid. Obviously, everything in the room was right, but that room is not the whole universe. So when the person, or science more truly, opens the door, so to speak, opens the window, and he realizes that the room exists within a house, and the house exists within a neighborhood, and the neighborhood within a city or a village, etc. So we're expanding. Science is being forced, since science is the investigation of truth. Humanity, in a sense, has given a mandate to science and scientists through this powerful discipline, scientific investigation, and all of its criteria for investigating truth, empirical, logical, etc. So science has received a mandate from humanity to investigate the real nature of the universe, of the physical reality. And when the old paradigm does not suffice any longer to explain the reality, because of these inconsistencies, because of the fact that there's phenomenon that cannot be explained within the confinement of the room or within the confinements of the old paradigm, that's when science has to undergoes what's called, or what Thomas Kuhn called, a paradigmatic shift. So there is the old paradigm, then a paradigmatic crisis. It can't explain a lot of phenomena. And then there is a paradigmatic shift, in a sense, opening the door and noticing and discovering that the room exists within a house, and the house within a neighborhood, etc. So that paradigmatic shift is from the old standard paradigm to a newer paradigm, scientific paradigm, which so that paradigmatic shift means we have to, in a sense, discard or expand the old paradigm and say that's not sufficient. Let's discover the new paradigm. The new paradigm, by the way, it seems always includes the old paradigm as a special case. And I can't I have to quote Einstein. Albert Einstein, considered to be one of the two greatest scientists the world has ever known. I must quote his humble remark when he was asked, I think by reporters, does he think that his theory will hold true forever? In other words, in 100 years. And he was very humble, and he said, no, I don't think that my theory will hold true forever. I just hope and believe that my theory, general relativity theory, will become a special case within a broader understanding, a theoretical framework. And that's essentially what's happening now with God's physics. So we made an introduction just explaining, according to Thomas Kuhn, that science cannot remain stuck in a paradigm for long. The paradigm reaches the limits of its usefulness, that standard paradigm in a given time or era, such as Newtonian mechanics was useful for the 17th and 18th, the 18th and 19th century. But then, because of inconsistencies and so forth, it had to give way, it had to do a paradigmatic shift from the old standard paradigm, in that case Newtonian classical mechanics, to the new paradigm of relativity theory. So now we're at the point of highlighting how does this paradigmatic shift occur. And I just have to mention the fact again. It's a great, in a sense, insight of Thomas Kuhn that we realize. He tells us that scientists are human beings, just like you and me. And as human beings, we have our own frailties. We have our own, in a sense, conservatism. Our own reluctance to give way or give up the old way that we've been accustomed to think about the world and embrace a newer approach. So that's what Thomas Kuhn is telling us, that the paradigmatic shift is a difficult phase for science, and more so for scientists. But ultimately, because it's very hard to give up the old paradigm and embrace a new paradigm. And again, I have to quote this. What comes to my mind every time that I think about this difficult juncture, this leap of a paradigmatic shift, which is difficult for us as human beings, and even for scientists as human beings, it's difficult. And I get reminded of Einstein's again ingenious remark, humble and ingenious remark. Einstein said that when he reflected and thought about, he said, sometimes I think about how come did I come to develop the theory or discover the theory of relativity? And he said, I think it's because most people wonder about space and time, energy, mass, big questions when they're children. And by the time they become adults, they've figured it out, quote unquote. They've figured it out. Meaning essentially that they've been, in a sense, conditioned to think and accept the acceptable normative way of looking at the world. He says, because my intellectual development was retarded, I continued to think about these important questions as an adult. Obviously, Einstein's intellectual development was not retarded, but he was open-minded, and he essentially is telling us that he continued to think about big questions and important questions in a childlike curiosity, even as an adult. He didn't accept the standard way of looking at things, and he wanted to know truth. So he investigated and thought outside of the box like a child does. This tells us, by the way, and encourages us that when science and scientists reach that point where they have to do a paradigmatic shift and they have to, in a sense, discard or at least enlarge and broaden the scope of the old standard paradigm, at that point in time, we need the courage, the openness, like Einstein, like a child that's not afraid to discover new things. So that's the point. So first of all, let me just again highlight the fact that 100 years ago, we had a paradigmatic shift, and we stand at the historic point that is equivalent to what happened 100 years ago. And by looking at what happened 100 years ago, over 100 years ago, we will get a glimpse and an encouragement and, in a sense, giving reinforcement for the paradigmatic shift that's now taking place to from the old what I call Material-Causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics to the new God's physics, in brackets, computational unified field theory. That's how I called the theory before, and I called it that in that name, computational unified field theory, in great respect for Einstein's quest for the last 3 decades of his life after such a unifying field theory that would resolve the theoretical inconsistency, bridge the gap between relativity theory about the macroscopic universe of galaxies, stars, planets, etc., and the microscopic realm of subatomic particles. And these two pillars of the old paradigm seem to be contradictory. We'll get to that in a second. So 100 years ago, we had an equivalent situation which we can learn from, and that was that there was a contradiction, apparent contradiction between Newtonian mechanics and the electromagnetic Maxwellian theory. They seem to contradict each other. That's obviously an impossible situation for science to remain in for long. Sometimes they give the metaphor. Imagine that you have a pilot flying, hovering over a palace, and it's a beautiful palace with greenery and perhaps lanterns of silver and gold, and a dome with gold and beautiful, surroundings. So the pilot hovering or flying over that palace would report and send us pictures of a palace. And imagine that his colleague would at the same time enter the palace, would get a permission to enter the palace, and he's sending us photos from the inside, from the interior of the palace. But lo and behold, those pictures describe a hut, even a run-down hut. Now, obviously, we would be confused and we would say something is wrong. It cannot be that the same object, the same reality, is a palace from the outside, but it's a run-down hut from the inside. That something doesn't mesh, something doesn't make sense. That's a metaphor for this paradigmatic crisis. That's a metaphor that's like an alarming sign or symptom that the old paradigm doesn't work any longer. And so, in a sense, that's where Newtonian mechanics, classical mechanics, the old standard paradigm stood just before Einstein's revolution of 1905 and 1915, and then the validation of his general relativity theory in 1919. So we had a contradiction, an apparent contradiction between the two pillars of the old paradigm of 18th and 19th century physics. Newtonian classical mechanics seemed to not be compatible with the newer discovered that time Maxwellian electromagnetic theory. And on top of that, perhaps even more alarming was the fact that a major phenomenon assumed by Newtonian mechanics, which was the ether concept, could not be verified, despite numerous attempts and experimentations to try and find that elusive ether element. Just to remind everybody, the ether element was assumed by Newtonian mechanics to perfuse, like a fine element that seemed to perfuse, to fill up the whole universe. But it was so fine, in a sense, or assumed to be so fine, and despite multiple experiments to try and find that quote-unquote elusive ether element, it could not be found. And in fact, what really happened was that we had the Michelson-Morley experiment, other experiments that tried to find that ether concept, but they failed to do so. And so at that time, two things happened. One, Einstein, in his great genius, said, well, if you cannot find the ether concept, let's discard it. We can't hold on to the concept as dear as it may be for the old paradigm. If we cannot find it, science at the end of the day is an empirical and logical endeavor. It's not just a matter of faith and belief. We have to verify it. And if we cannot find the ether concept, we have to discard it. And then he came up with relativity theory with a few postulates, and he was able to resolve the apparent inconsistency between Maxwellian electromagnetic theory and Newtonian mechanics. Newtonian mechanics became a special case within general relativity theory. And the important point is that remember we posed the question, so according to Thomas Kuhn, scientists and science more generally find it difficult to let go of the old standard paradigm and embrace the new paradigm. So how does it eventually make that leap? What forces it, in a sense, or encourages it and forces it to make that leap, to broaden, to open the door and see the house? Well, that happens when the new paradigm, in this case, the newer paradigm of general relativity theory, comes up, identifies a specific, unique critical prediction. And that unique critical prediction differentiates the new paradigm, in this case of general relativity theory, prediction, as opposed to the old Newtonian mechanics prediction. And so Einstein really identified one case, one scenario, or one situation regarding, again, the pathway, the curvature, perihelion curvature pathway of Mercury, the planet closest to the sun in our solar system. And he predicted that due to the new theory's understanding that massive objects curve space and time, general relativity theory predicted a double value, a much more intense, much more curved pathway of Mercury around the sun, which again was 1.6 arc as opposed to 0.8 arc according to Newtonian mechanics. The minute that Einstein was able to identify a very unique, specific critical prediction of his new general relativity theory that differs significantly and can be tested empirically from the old Newtonian mechanics, and the minute that we had this very bold and great astronomer, British astronomer Eddington, verified during the 1919 solar eclipse, he verified that in fact, empirically, Einstein's prediction of general relativity theory of 1.6 arc came out to be true, and Newton's prediction of 0.8 failed. So at that point, when science and scientists can identify at least one, that's sufficient, one instance in which the new paradigm's prediction is more valid than the old paradigm predictions, the minute that we identify such a case, and then it's verified empirically, as Eddington did in 1919 solar eclipse, that's when science and scientists have to give up the old paradigm and have to embrace the new paradigm. And the beauty of it is that, again, for example, general relativity theory does not negate Newtonian mechanics, but Newtonian mechanics became a special case for non-relativistic speeds in objects. So now we start understanding, regardless of our background, even for the general public and layman viewers and readers, we start understanding that how science evolves. Now let's jump ahead 100 years forward to our own time, and let's say that the same criteria. There is a paradigmatic crisis in the what I call now the old material-causal paradigm of relativity theory and general relativity theory and quantum mechanics. They seem to contradict each other. If I had to highlight that, I would say that relativity theory has the speed of light barrier, which does not allow any information or any interaction to cross space and time in a rate faster than the speed of light barrier or limit. So that means that if we had a hypothetical situation that, God forbid, the sun would be extinguished at this moment, God forbid, it would still take 8 minutes for the last ray of light to leave the sun and reach our planet Earth. So there's, in a sense, a delay. There's a cause and effect, and there's a limit of the speed of light barrier. Things don't happen instantaneously because it takes time for the ray of light to travel from the cause, from the event, to the observer. If we took an equivalent situation in quantum mechanics, it's very well known, this phenomenon of quantum entanglement, where we had two particles that share a lot of properties, and then they're separated. And when they're separated, let's say in an equivalent situation of 8 minutes traveling pathway of a light signal from one to another, and we make a measurement in one of these entangled particles, lo and behold, this was verified by Bell's experiment, famous experiment, verified a few times. So if we measured one entangled particle, we find out that the complementary measurement in the other entangled particle is determined instantaneously, as if there's no limit about the speed of light that has to bridge the gap between them. In a sense, it seems not to be causal, even though in a second I'll explain that both quantum mechanics and relativity theory, really in a deep manner, they're underlined by this old material-causal paradigm, which does denote causality. But for this is just an explanation that there seems to be a contradiction between relativity theory, which possesses the speed of light barrier limit for the transmission or for an effect of any kind of effect across space and time, as opposed to quantum entanglement, which seems to suggest that things can happen instantaneously without the light signal having to, or limit. In a sense, it negates the speed of light barrier. So we have a contradiction in the old material-causal paradigm. In a sense, that's equivalent to the contradiction between Maxwellian theory and the Newtonian mechanics. That's a sign, remember, a symptom, a sign, an alarming sign that the old material-causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics is crashing, or it's reaching a paradigmatic crisis, which necessitates it to make that leap, the paradigmatic shift to the new paradigm, which we're suggesting is the new God's physics paradigm, computational unified field theory. And again, equivalent, we have another situation, another phenomenon. Remember the ether concept, which was a major problem because it could not be verified, but yet it was a basis for the old Newtonian mechanics. Now we have an equivalent situation. We have what's called the dark matter, dark energy, purely hypothetical concepts, which are in a sense assumed. They're the basis for the old material-causal paradigm. So that dark matter, dark energy, purely hypothetical concepts essentially assume that the universe is perfused, is filled up with most of the energy and mass in the universe. Most of the energy and the mass in the universe are assumed to comprise dark matter, dark energy, up to 95%. And that 95% of what's assumed to be dark matter, dark energy cannot be detected. And that's a major problem. It has to do something with the accelerated rate of expansion of the universe. Maybe I'll touch upon that. But we stand at a historic point where we have a paradigmatic crisis. And by the way, just to make it clear that it's not just me talking about it, and all the articles that I published and keynote lectures. Scientific American, one of the most prestigious scientific journals today, published an article just a short while ago, the title of which was "The Last Stand of Dark Matter, Dark Energy," essentially saying that if after 2 decades, full decades of intensive experimentations to try and find that elusive dark matter, dark energy, purely hypothetical concepts, and since it failed to detect those purely hypothetical dark matter, dark energy concepts, then Scientific American is telling us it's the last stand of dark matter, dark energy. In other words, it's telling us these are alarming signs, and unless somebody is able to directly verify and prove the existence of dark matter, dark energy, then we'll have to discard it. And I actually went ahead a while ago now, maybe a few years, a part of those 60 to 70 peer-reviewed scientific articles. One of them was, could dark matter, dark energy be superfluous? Einstein discarded the ether concept, essentially saying it's superfluous, it cannot be detected, and we don't need it for the new paradigm. And I did the same thing. So I suggested that dark matter, dark energy are superfluous, i.e. non-existent, and we have to expand the model. So now the most important element is, okay, we see there's a paradigmatic crisis between relativity theory, quantum mechanics, which are the pillars of the old material-causal paradigm. We see that there's a major phenomena, which again is the purely hypothetical dark matter, dark energy concepts that comprise up to 95% of all the assumed energy and mass in the universe, but yet could not be detected. That's a major problem. And so, but the turning point, the historic turning point that we stand at this very moment in time, is the fact that the new God's physics, or computational field theory, has identified two critical predictions, unique critical predictions of the new God's physics paradigm. One of them has to do with the non-continuous accelerated rate of the universe's expansion. That's a unique critical prediction predicted by God's physics, but not predicted by the old material-causal paradigm. And it was just verified, I'll talk about it in a second, through the astronomical, cosmological astronomical gap in the universe's expansion rate. The other phenomenon is called the proton radius puzzle, and again, it's the findings there are directly validating God's physics new paradigm prediction, but not predictions of quantum mechanics. And so because we have these two phenomena that I'm going to speak about briefly, that have been verified, two predictions, critical predictions that are unique to the God's physics paradigm, but cannot be explained by the old material-causal paradigm. Therefore, because it's been verified and validated empirically now, we stand at a historic point, which is just equivalent to Eddington's verification of Einstein's critical prediction about Mercury's double-valued perihelion around the sun. So it's a historic turning point. I'll talk after I describe these verifications, I'll talk about the postulates of the theory, I'll talk about the ramifications for a new universe, for a new understanding of humanity and science, about the true origin and sustenance and evolution and even goal of the universe's evolution, the centrality of human consciousness, the new understanding of where the universe is leading humanity. But just two words, two words about these verifications, unique validation or empirical validation of these unique critical predictions of God's physics paradigm. So first of all, again, about the non-continuous accelerated rate of the universe's expansion. Remember I spoke about dark matter, dark energy. So those purely hypothetical concepts which have to be discarded because they cannot be found and so forth. So those purely hypothetical dark matter, dark energy concepts, they arise from the fact that the old general relativity theory model, in order to explain the empirically observed accelerated rate of the universe's expansion, they have the old model relativity theory. Old model has to assume that we have these dark matter, dark energy concepts, and because they cannot be verified empirically, the old model suffers. Now I'm contrasting that. So, but let's just emphasize the fact that according to the old relativistic general relativity theory model, the expansion of the universe, even though it's at an accelerated rate, it remains constant. And that constancy is explained by dark matter, dark energy, which again is very problematic because they cannot be found. Now I'm contrasting that to the prediction of God's physics paradigm, new paradigm, and God's physics new paradigm because it assumes, and this is perhaps a good place to just highlight one of the major discoveries of this new God's physics paradigm. In order to resolve the apparent theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, in order to do that, the new God's physics paradigm essentially discovered the existence of a singular, higher-ordered, universal computational/consciousness principle. And that UCP, universal computational/consciousness principle, is producing the whole universe as an extremely rapid series of three-dimensional frames. So at every trillionth of a second, etc., it's c squared divided by Planck's constant, which gives us 1.36 in the power of minus 50, many billions and trillions of times per second. So at each trillionth of a trillionth, etc., of a second, the UCP computes and creates the whole universe as a reality simultaneously. Then it dissolves back to the UCP, and then it produces a new frame. And by the way, those frames are each time produced larger by the UCP, meaning that's the explanation in the sense of the accelerated expansion of the universe. But the thing is, because this new God's physics paradigm discovered the existence of this singular, higher-ordered universal consciousness principle, there's another assumption, which I call the collective human consciousness focus of the new God's physics paradigm, essentially saying that every time we have a collective human consciousness focus of, let's say, millions of individuals focusing on this universal consciousness principle, UCP, the assumption is that then the UCP will then make a non-continuous increase in the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion, essentially saying that there will be leaps. It's not a constant accelerated rate of expansion. It actually increases over time. And I suggested, and I'm still calling astronomers, cosmologists to test around the Jewish Rosh Hashanah New Year 2 days interval. Last year it was September 27th, 28th. And I called astronomers, cosmologists to test the rate of the universe's expansion before, in this case, September 27th, 28th, and from the 27th, 28th of October onwards. And I predicted that there will be, again, a non-continuous leap or increase in the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion. So far, I've not received sufficient details from cosmologists and astronomers. I'm still waiting for those for this data to come in. But regardless of that very specific prediction about the Jewish Rosh Hashanah, which is an instant of this collective human consciousness focus, regardless of that, there's been already an empirical verification of this unique critical prediction of God's physics paradigm, because that's called, I mentioned that earlier, that's called the astronomical cosmological gap in the universe's rate of expansion. Essentially saying that when we look at early stages of the universe, assumed to correlate to the background radiation following the Big Bang event. So when we measure the background radiation, radiation of the beginning of the universe, and we measure the rate of the universe's expansion then, and we compare that to the rate of the universe's expansion rate now by cosmological measures of the farthest reaches of the universe, we see that the rate is non-continuous. It's increased significantly. So that would support, that validates the prediction of God's physics paradigm that there is a non-continuous increase in the universe's rate of expansion. So that's one verification of, again, a unique critical prediction of God's physics paradigm, equivalent to what Eddington verified about Einstein's general relativity theory, and leading inevitably to the acceptance of this new God's physics paradigm as a new 21st century scientific paradigm. The other phenomena, without going into too many details, not to make it too long, it's called the proton radius puzzle, and essentially it has to do with the inability of quantum mechanics to explain why, when we compare and contrast between a normal hydrogen atom with an electron circling the nucleus within which we have the proton, the positively charged particle. And we compare the proton radius within the standard hydrogen atom to the proton radius within a muon replaced hydrogen atom. In other words, we replace the negatively charged electron with a negatively charged particle called the muon, which is much more massive than the electron. And when we contrast those, we see that in the case of the muon hydrogen atom, the muon has an effect on the proton radius, which shrinks and is much more accurate. And it's not understandable. It's called the proton radius puzzle because it cannot be explained in a sense by the old quantum mechanics model. But lo and behold, and this was actually published even before as far as I remember, before those results of the proton radius puzzle in 2010. And but in any event, the predictions of God's physics paradigm, the critical prediction is that because the UCP computes, remember, the whole universe, every spatial pixel, every atom, every minimal spatial pixel comprising the whole universe simultaneously, every time it creates a whole picture, universal frame of the whole universe, it lasts for a trillionth of a trillionth, etc. of a second, and then it dissolves back into this UCP and so forth and so on. So within that model, we also understand that the UCP computes for every spatial pixel in the universe simultaneously its space, time, energy, and mass components. And it does so through what I call three computational dimensions. Two of them are very relevant for our issue right now, which is framework and consistency. And those framework and consistency essentially create the combination, creates the four basic physical features of space energy, which is frame, consistent frame, inconsistent computational measures, and mass and time, which is object consistent versus inconsistent computational measures. And because of that new computational definition of space-time, energy, and mass, which are simultaneously computed by the UCP, and by the way, there is a new what I call universal computational formula, which for the first time in science completely integrates between those four basic physical features of space, time, energy, and mass. To remind us, Einstein, the great Einstein, was able to unify between space and time, and then between energy and mass equivalence, and then the curvature of space-time by mass of objects, but it was not a complete unification of all these four basic physical features. And that's what is accomplished by the new God's physics paradigm. So the prediction of God's physics paradigm is that the way the computational definition of mass denotes that a more massive particle such as a muon will have to be spatially consistent, much more spatially consistent or condensed as an object, both smaller and more accurate than, let's say, a less massive particle such as the electron. So again, we find a situation that the new God's physics paradigm has now two initial empirical validations of its critical predictions, unique critical predictions that was found to be more valid than the corresponding predictions of general relativity theory and quantum mechanics. And that's why we are really standing at a historic point, exciting historic point, that the new God's physics paradigm has to be accepted and is being accepted by the scientific community as the new 21st century theoretical physics and scientific paradigm. Excuse me. Now, before we move on to highlighting what tremendous change, profound change that creates in our basic understanding of the universe, and what profound change it has for the general public and not just for scientists. So let me just highlight a few of the points which will give us a much greater understanding of the new God's physics understanding of the universe. I would say that perhaps three major changes, breakthroughs, or paradigmatic shift changes in our basic understanding of the universe. One is that the new God's physics paradigm is called an acausal computation paradigm. Essentially, it's telling us that since the UCP computes simultaneously all the spatial pixels of the universe for each frame, So because it's computing them at the same time, there cannot be cause and effect between them. And also between one frame and another, the whole universe dissolves back into this UCP. So there cannot be any cause and effect relationships between the first frame, second frame, third frame, nth frame. So we just discarded, did away with the old, what I call Material-Causal paradigm. And that's perhaps a good place to explain that underlying both relativity theory and quantum mechanics is a basic, what I call Material-Causal assumption. Therefore, I call the old paradigm as Material-Causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics. And surprisingly, both relativity theory and quantum mechanics assume this material causality, assume that everything in the universe happens or occurs by cause and effect. So general relativity theory says the universe was created by a Big Bang nuclear event, which then created from a condensed lump of matter, erupted and created the suns, the galaxies, all mass and energy in the universe, and gave it an impetus for the universe to expand. That's cause and effect. In quantum mechanics,